Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Hollow Whistle. It had been a long day of hiking, and Greg had finally arrived at his campsite, deep within the Canadian Rockies. He was a seasoned solo hiker, used to the silence of nature and the solitude of the trails. But this trip felt different. The wilderness here felt more isolated, more untouched. The kind of place where if something were to happen, no one would find you for days. The evening was crisp, the air thick with the scent of pine and earth. Greg had set up his tent by a small creek, the sound of water trickling gently in the background. The forest around him was dense, the trees thick enough to obscure the sky above. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the land. He made a quick fire to cook his dinner, and after a long day of hiking, he was eager to sleep under the stars. As night fell, a chill settled in the air. Greg crawled into his tent, his body tired from the strenuous hike, and pulled his sleeping bag tight around him. The fire flickered and crackled outside, providing the only light in the otherwise pitch-black forest. He had no reason to believe anything was wrong, but something about the quiet was unnerving. The woods felt too still. It was around midnight when it started. At first, it was a soft sound, so faint that Greg thought he might have imagined it. A whistle, distant and high-pitched, floating on the night air. It was unlike any animal sound he had ever heard. He frowned, wondering if it was another hiker or someone else in the area. But no one had passed by his campsite all day, and there were no other tents in sight. He lay still listening. The whistle came again, louder this time. It sounded almost like a person calling out, but there was something wrong about it, something hollow, unnatural. The tone seemed to echo in the dense forest, like a voice trying to reach him through the thick walls of the trees, but distorted somehow. Greg's heart rate quickened as the sound grew louder, the pitch higher, almost as if it were beckoning him, calling him to the woods beyond his camp. His unease deepened. There was no way anyone would be out here at this hour, not so far off the beaten path. The whistle had a strange quality, a resonance that felt eerie. It didn't make sense. He had hiked alone in remote places before, but he had never experienced anything like this. Greg slowly unzipped his tent and poked his head outside. The darkness of the woods swallowed everything. There was nothing but the faint glow of his fire casting long shadows against the trees. No sign of anyone, no movement, just the dense silence of the forest. The whistle sounded again, louder this time. It was unmistakably coming from somewhere deeper in the woods, from the direction of the creek. The sound was so strange, so alien, that it sent a chill down his spine. It almost seemed like it was calling his name, though he couldn't quite make out the words. Greg's eyes scanned the forest, his mind racing. Was it an animal? Some strange bird or creature? The more he thought about it, the more it didn't make sense. He knew the area well enough. There were no known animals that made such a sound. The whistle didn't belong to any creature he had ever encountered. He thought about grabbing his flashlight and venturing into the woods, but something held him back. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't something he wanted to confront. Instead, he crawled back into his tent and pulled the zipper shut. trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. He lay there, eyes wide open, listening as the whistle continued, growing louder and closer with each passing minute. Time seemed to stretch on forever. His mind played tricks on him, and he imagined the sound moving all around him, circling his campsite like an invisible predator. It wasn't the sound of something alive. It was the sound of something otherworldly, something not quite human. The night dragged on, and Greg tried to block out the whistle, focusing on the sounds of the wind in the trees, the babble of the creek, anything to distract him. But the whistle wouldn't stop. It came again and again until it felt like it was inside his head. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the whistle finally stopped. Just like that. The silence that followed was almost worse, unnatural, too quiet. Greg lay there for a moment, frozen, unsure of what to do. The feeling of being watched hung heavy in the air. He didn't waste any time. The moment the sun's light fully broke through the trees, he packed up his gear and quickly broke down his camp. He didn't even bother making coffee or breakfast. All he wanted was to leave. The forest, once so familiar and beautiful, now felt like a place of menace. As he hiked out of the woods, his heart still racing, Greg kept looking over his shoulder. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him, something lurking just beyond his vision. The memory of that hollow whistle, that eerie sound that had filled the night, haunted him the entire way back. He never spoke about what happened at that campsite to anyone. Couldn't bring himself to. It was a story that didn't make sense, a haunting that he could never fully explain. But as the years passed, he would often wonder what that sound had been. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled through the trees, he would hear the faintest echo of a whistle, as if something or someone was still calling out to him from the darkness. The hollow whistle remained one of the strangest, most unsettling experiences of Greg's life. It wasn't just the sound that haunted him. It was the feeling of being prey, stalked by something that existed in the spaces between the trees, in the silence of the night. Something that didn't belong in the woods, but was there anyway, waiting. Story 2. The red-eyed animal. It was the kind of camping trip that had always been dreamed about. A group of 5 friends, all seasoned hikers, had chosen a secluded spot deep in the Adirondack Mountains for their weekend retreat. They wanted to escape the chaos of city life and reconnect with nature. The plan was simple. Set up camp near a crystal-clear lake, spend a couple of days hiking, and enjoy the peace of the forest. But nothing about this trip would be simple. The days started like any other. Birds singing, the rustling of leaves in the wind, and the soft murmur of the lake as it lapped against the shore. They unpacked their gear, pitched their tents, and gathered around the fire pit as the sun began to set. As night crept in, the shadows in the forest deepened, and the tranquil atmosphere of the Adirondacks shifted, the forest becoming thick with quiet. Around the campfire, they joked and laughed, oblivious to the darkness creeping in on them. But that peace didn't last long. One of the group, Alex, noticed something strange from the corner of his eye. He looked toward the tree line at the edge of the campsite and saw a large figure standing motionless in the shadows. The figure was big, too big to be a deer or anything they were used to seeing. It seemed to be watching them, "Hey guys, do you see that?" Alex asked, his voice uncertain as he pointed toward the shape. Everyone turned to look, but at first they couldn't make out any details. The figure was standing so still that it seemed almost like a trick of the light. But Alex's gut told him something was wrong. He reached for his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. When he turned it toward the figure, his breath caught in his throat. The eyes of the creature glowed bright red, unnaturally bright. They burned like two small, menacing embers in the pitch-black forest. Alex's pulse quickened as the rest of the group followed his gaze. It was huge, almost the size of a bear, but something about it felt completely wrong. It didn't move like a bear, didn't have the shape of any animal they had ever seen. Its body was vaguely hunched, but not in any natural way. It seemed to be watching them with an intelligence that felt unnatural. "Should we check it out?" whispered Jake, the bravest of the group, though there was a tremor in his voice now. No one answered right away. Instead of moving closer, the group stayed still, watching the figure in the dark. The red eyes never blinked, never looked away. It felt like it was studying them. The hairs on the back of their necks stood up, and a deep, gnawing fear took hold. "Let's shine the light again," Sarah said. She had a calmness to her voice, but it didn't fool anyone. She was just as scared as the rest of them. They all aimed their flashlights toward the figure once more. This time, they saw it move, a slow, unnatural motion. It was as if it didn't have to walk, but simply slid out of view, vanishing into the woods with eerie silence. The group sat frozen, heartbeats loud in their ears, eyes scanning the trees, searching for any sign of movement. But it was gone. There was nothing but the darkness of the forest surrounding them. "What the hell was that?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. That wasn't a bear, was it?" "No way," Jake said, his voice shaking now. "Bears don't do that." And those eyes, they were glowing. A long silence stretched between them, filled only with the crackling of the fire. Each of them had their own thoughts, but none of them spoke. The sense of something sinister was heavy in the air, thick and suffocating. They tried to convince themselves that it was just their imagination, that it was a trick of the light or maybe an odd animal they had never seen before. But none of them truly believed it. "Should we go check it out?" Alex asked after a while, his voice tight with nervousness. He was trying to sound brave, but they all knew he didn't want to go anywhere near that creature. "No," Jake replied quickly, his eyes scanning the dark woods. "I'm not going near that thing. Let's just stay here and wait until morning." So they huddled together, talking nervously about what they had seen. As the night grew colder and darker, the firelight seemed weaker, casting long shadows that made the trees around them appear to move. They kept their eyes on the forest, alert for any sign of movement. But it was still. There was nothing else. Finally, exhausted from the tension and adrenaline, they reluctantly went to their tents. No one slept well. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig in the night made their hearts race. The idea of something watching them from the darkness, those glowing red eyes fixed on them, haunted each of them. Morning came slowly, the soft light of dawn creeping into the forest, and with it came a sense of relief. They emerged from their tents, blinking against the light, still shaken by the events of the night before. "We should check the area," Alex suggested, his voice barely above a whisper. The group agreed, although none of them really wanted to go out there. They walked to the edge of the campsite where the creature had stood, their footsteps heavy with apprehension. They searched the ground, looking for tracks, anything that might confirm they hadn't imagined it. But there was nothing, not a single footprint, no broken branches or disturbed underbrush. The ground was undisturbed, and the area looked as if nothing had been there at all. They stood there for a long moment, staring at the untouched forest. No one spoke. They all felt it, the cold, lingering fear that there was something in those woods, something unnatural that wasn't meant to be there. "I don't know what we saw last night," Sarah finally said, her voice trembling. "But I'm not sticking around to find out. Let's get out of here." They packed up their gear as quickly as they could, the sense of urgency pressing down on them. The wilderness, once a peaceful retreat, now felt hostile, almost alive with something they couldn't understand. As they left the campsite, no one spoke again. They all knew that what they had encountered in the dark of the Adirondacks would stay with them forever. The red eyes, the shadow in the trees. They couldn't explain it, but none of them would ever forget it, and they never returned to that campsite again. Story 3. The Old Man in the Woods. It was the kind of family camping trip that was supposed to create lasting memories. Good times around the campfire, stories, laughter, and the peaceful sounds of nature. The Walters family had been camping in the North Carolina woods before, but this trip felt different. The air was crisp with the scent of pine, and the sky was darkening with the kind of early evening glow that made the forest feel both magical and intimidating. They had arrived earlier that day, setting up their campsite near a small clearing surrounded by thick woods. It was the perfect spot, isolated, quiet, and far from any sign of civilization. After gathering firewood, roasting marshmallows, and sharing a simple dinner, the family settled in for the night. The warmth from the fire flickered in the growing darkness, and the sound of crickets filled the air. Around 9 p.m., just as the fire was starting to die down, they heard something strange, a rustling from the edge of the trees. At first, they thought it might have been an animal, but the noise persisted, growing louder and closer. The children, initially excited, grew quiet, sensing that something wasn't quite right. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows, a frail, elderly man, his clothes ragged and worn as if he had been wandering for days. He seemed disoriented, and his movements were slow, as though every step took immense effort. His pale skin looked almost translucent in the firelight, and his hunched shoulders gave him an almost ghostly appearance. "Excuse me," the man said in a weak, trembling voice, his words soft but urgent. "Have you seen my wife? I can't find her. We were here together, but she disappeared." The family was caught off guard. The man's presence in the woods, especially this deep in the forest, seemed out of place. Their initial instinct was to help, but there was something unsettling about his demeanor. His eyes, though filled with confusion, carried an unsettling emptiness to them. It was as if he was seeing something, or someone no one else could see. "We haven't seen anyone," the father, Tom, replied, trying to offer some comfort. "We're just camping here. Are you lost? Do you need help?" The man didn't respond right away. Instead, he stared at them blankly, as if his mind was somewhere else entirely. His gaze was unfocused, and the longer he stood there, the more the family felt a growing sense of unease. It wasn't just that he was lost. It felt as though something was wrong, something beyond simple confusion. After what felt like an eternity, the man finally blinked and muttered, I think I'll be all right." He turned slowly and started walking back toward the trees without another word. Tom, not sure what to make of the situation, stood up and called after the man. "Sir, are you sure you're okay? It's dangerous out here at night, especially alone." But the man didn't respond. He simply continued walking into the woods, his slow pace taking him farther from the campsite. Soon, the darkness swallowed him whole, and the only evidence he had been there was the eerie silence that followed. The family sat in stunned silence for several moments, unsure of what had just transpired. The man's odd behavior left them with an unsettling feeling in the pit of their stomachs. What kind of person would be wandering alone in the woods at this hour? And why did he seem so out of place? After a few minutes, Tom decided to go after him. "Stay here," he told his wife and children. "I'll see if I can find him and make sure he's all right." Tom ventured into the woods, calling out occasionally, but there was no sign of the old man. The forest was eerily still, as if holding its breath. After what felt like an hour of searching, Tom gave up. There was no trace of the man, no footprints, no sounds, nothing. He returned to the campsite, where his family was still sitting in the glow of the dying fire. The night passed uneventfully, but the encounter with the old man stayed with them. The air felt colder now, and they couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, hidden just beyond the trees. They locked their tents and kept the fire burning long into the night, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, after packing up their gear and preparing to leave the campsite, Tom decided to stop by the nearby ranger station to report the strange encounter. The ranger, a middle-aged man named Rick, listened attentively as Tom explained the details of what had happened. Rick nodded slowly, a knowing look crossing his face. "You saw him, didn't you?" he asked, almost as if he'd been expecting this conversation. Tom was taken aback. "You know who I'm talking about?" Rick's face darkened. "That man, he's been gone for years." Tom blinked in confusion. "What do you mean?" "He was just here last night. I spoke to him. He seemed lost, looking for his wife." Rick sighed heavily and leaned forward, lowering his voice. "That man was last seen hiking in these woods over 10 years ago. He and his wife went missing during a camping trip, and they were never found. No one's ever seen him again. I'm sorry to say, but that man, if it was him, should have been long gone." Tom felt a chill run down his spine. He couldn't process what he was hearing. It didn't make sense. How could the man he spoke to last night have been dead for so long? Rick continued, his voice grim. "We've had a few reports of strange sightings in these woods over the years. People see a man, always looking lost, asking about his wife. It's like he's stuck in time, unable to move on." Tom's mind raced, but the words didn't make sense. They couldn't make sense. He tried to piece together what had happened the previous evening. The old man's confusion, his hollow stare, the way he had simply vanished into the woods. It was all too much. Rick gave him a sympathetic look. Some things happen out here that we can't explain. Maybe that's one of them. As Tom and his family drove away from the ranger station, the woods seemed even darker now, the trees stretching endlessly, hiding their secrets. They would never forget the old man they had met in the woods, an encounter that was both haunting and impossible to understand. And even as the years passed, the Walters family couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't just met a lost soul in the woods, but something far older, far darker than they could ever imagine. The old man was a ghost trapped in the endless expanse of the forest, searching for his wife, and perhaps, in some way, still searching for a way to be found. Story 4. The Phantom Fisherman. It was one of those quiet mornings in Michigan, the kind that seems to exist in a suspended moment between dusk and dawn. The air was crisp, and the only sound was the gentle lapping of water against the shore of the small, secluded lake. Adam had always loved this spot, a hidden gem tucked away from the hustle and bustle of the world. It was a place where he could go to clear his mind, a place where nothing seemed to matter except the rhythmic cast of his fishing line. Adam had arrived early, before the first rays of sunlight broke over the tree-line. He set up his gear and cast his line, the water still enough that the line sliced through it silently. The lake was his sanctuary, a place where he could leave behind the stress of life and lose himself in the peaceful solitude of nature. He'd camped here many times before, and on this particular morning, the silence felt almost sacred. For hours, Adam sat on the rocky shore, watching his bobber drift lazily in the water. The fishing was slow, as it often was early in the morning, but that didn't bother him. He was content to simply be alone, to listen to the sounds of the forest waking up around him. After a while, he noticed movement across the lake. It was faint at first, just a shadow against the morning mist rising from the water. A figure. Someone else had come to fish. Adam squinted across the lake, trying to make out the details of the person's silhouette. It was a man, sitting quietly at the water's edge, his fishing rod cast into the lake. Curious, Adam waved to him, though he wasn't sure if the man could see him from this distance. But the figure didn't respond. There was no wave back, no nod of acknowledgement, nothing. Adam thought it odd, but then again, some people prefer to fish in silence. He returned to his own line, focused on the slow movement of his bobber. Still, something about the man on the opposite shore lingered in his thoughts. There was something eerie in the stillness of the other fisherman. Minutes passed, and Adam's curiosity began to grow. He stood up, grabbing his paddle, and decided to row across the lake to get a closer look. The water was calm, and the mist was beginning to lift, revealing the full expanse of the lake. As Adam rowed across, he kept his eyes on the fisherman, but something felt off. The closer Adam got, the more he felt a sense of unease creeping up his spine. The figure remained motionless, facing the water, his back turned to Adam. Adam's stroke became stronger, and he reached the opposite shore quicker than he had anticipated. As he paddled closer to where the man had been sitting, his heart began to race. But when he arrived at the spot, the fisherman was gone. Adam's eyes scanned the area frantically, but there was no sign of the man. No footprints, no other signs of life. Not even a disturbance in the water where the fisherman's line had been cast. The spot was eerily still. Confused, Adam looked around, trying to make sense of what had happened. His eyes landed on the fishing line still hanging in the water, moving gently with the current. The line was taut, as if something had been caught, but there was no sign of the fisherman who had been sitting just moments before. He reached for the line and tugged gently, pulling in a small fish that had been caught on the hook. But there was still no sign of the man who had been there, only the remains of his presence. An empty spot on the shore and the fishing line still drifting in the water. A chill ran down Adam's spine. He sat still for a long moment, trying to understand what had just happened. He had seen the man. He had waved at him. And yet, now he was gone, as though he had never been there at all. Adam reluctantly paddled back to his camp, his mind racing. His fishing trip was over, but he couldn't shake the feeling of something being terribly wrong. He gathered his gear quickly and started to pack up, the unease gnawing at him. As he made his way to the parking lot, Adam encountered a local who had been walking near the lake. The man noticed Adam's troubled expression and asked if everything was all right. Adam hesitated, then asked casually, "Hey, did you know anything about a fisherman who might have been out on the lake this morning?" The local looked at him, his brow furrowing. "You mean the man who drowned here a few years ago?" Adam froze. "What? What are you talking about?" The local went on to explain that several years earlier, a fisherman had been found dead in the lake, having drowned under mysterious circumstances. The man had been an experienced angler, known to frequent that same spot Adam had visited. Despite numerous search efforts, his body was never recovered, and locals had speculated that something strange had happened. Perhaps the fisherman had fallen in the lake while reaching for his gear, or had met with an accident in the water. But no one knew for sure. Adam felt the blood drain from his face. His encounter with the fisherman from that morning had suddenly taken on a far more chilling significance. The figure he had seen, sitting motionless at the edge of the lake, had not been a man fishing at all. It had been the ghost of the drowned fisherman, forever bound to the place where his life had ended. Later, Adam would tell himself that it was just his imagination. But deep down, he knew what he had seen, and he would never again visit that quiet lake alone, not after meeting the phantom fisherman. Story 5. The Shadow in the Tent. It was a crisp, clear night in the Wyoming wilderness. The couple, Sarah and Mark, had arrived at the remote campsite earlier that afternoon. They had been looking forward to a weekend getaway, away from the hustle and bustle of the city, to enjoy the serenity of nature. Surrounded by towering pine trees and distant mountain views, it felt like they had found the perfect spot to unwind. As night fell, they huddled inside their tent, eating a simple dinner of trail mix and sandwiches, then settled in to sleep under the open sky. The only sounds were the rustling of the wind through the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, almost too quiet, but that's exactly how they liked it. Around midnight, Sarah woke with a start. At first, she thought she was dreaming, but then she realized it wasn't a dream. She could feel it, a presence outside their tent. The fabric of the tent shifted, as if something was moving around it. Her heart began to race, and she nudged Mark awake. "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Do you hear that?" Mark, groggy from sleep, listened intently. He could hear the faint sounds of movement, soft footsteps, the gentle scrape of something brushing against the fabric. His breath caught in his throat as he tried to make sense of it. "It's probably an animal," Mark said, though his voice lacked the conviction he wished he had. But Sarah wasn't convinced. The sound didn't have the irregularity of an animal. It was too deliberate, too controlled. Her gut told her it wasn't just an animal rummaging around. The two of them lay still, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease that gnawed at them. The sound seemed to circle around the tent, growing louder and closer, as if whatever it was pacing just outside. Sarah could see a shadow through the thin fabric of the tent, something large and shifting, almost human in shape. Her breath quickened as her mind raced. "It looks like a person," she whispered, gripping Mark's arm. Mark, now wide awake, scanned the edges of the tent where the shadow flickered. There was no way they could be mistaken. It looked like a figure, moving slowly, carefully. It hovered just outside, but no sound came from the footsteps, only the faint, unsettling sound of something, or someone, shifting in the dark. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Neither of them dared to move, their breaths shallow and quick, their hearts hammered in their chests. Whoever, or whatever, was out there didn't seem to make any noise. It was as if the shadow itself was trying to remain invisible, lurking just on the edge of their vision. Sarah and Mark exchanged nervous glances, both too scared to speak. If it was a person, what were they doing here, in the middle of nowhere, without a campsite of their own? The nearest neighbor was miles away, and they hadn't seen anyone since they set up camp earlier in the day. The shadow shifted again, this time moving lower, almost as if it were crouching or kneeling. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It felt wrong, unnatural. They were trapped in their tent, unable to see or confront whatever was out there. The shadow disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving the night around them eerily still. Sarah held her breath, straining to listen, but all she could hear was the faint whisper of the wind through the trees. The figure was gone. Mark slowly exhaled, relieved but still on edge. "I don't know what that was," he whispered. For the next few hours, neither of them slept, and the sounds outside were eerily silent. They listened for any movement, but heard nothing. The night seemed to stretch on forever, and every creak of the tent or rustle of leaves outside made them jump. At first light, they ventured cautiously outside, both of them on edge. The sun had barely risen, and the forest was still shrouded in mist. As they looked around their campsite, they noticed something unsettling. There were no tracks, no footprints anywhere around the tent. There was no sign of anyone having been there. But the grass near the tent was flattened, as if someone had been kneeling there, leaning close to the fabric, listening. It was as though the figure had never left any trace of its existence, but the indentation in the grass told them something had been there, something that should not have been. They packed up their campsite hurriedly, their nerves on edge, not wanting to stay in the area any longer. The peace they had come to find in the wilderness had been shattered by the eerie sensation that they were being watched, hunted, by something they couldn't understand. Neither of them spoke much as they packed their gear, both trying to shake the image of that shadow from their minds. Once they were packed and ready to leave, Sarah looked back at the spot where they had slept. The wind had picked up, sweeping the mist away, but the unease lingered in the air. The wilderness, once so beautiful and peaceful, had become something else. They left the area behind without another glance, thankful to be leaving the strange and unexplainable experience behind them. To this day, neither Sarah nor Mark can explain what they saw that night. The shadow, the strange feeling of being watched, and the unsettling absence of tracks in the morning. All of it remains a mystery. But one thing is certain, they never camped in that part of Wyoming again. Story 6. The Mysterious Campsite. A group of 5 friends, Sarah, Ben, Jake, Emily, and Lisa, had been planning their camping trip for months. They'd researched the perfect spot, a popular camping area deep in the national forest. It was secluded enough to give them peace and quiet, but still close enough to civilization in case of an emergency. After a few hours of driving, they finally reached the trailhead, excited and ready for the weekend of adventure. The trail was well marked, winding through tall pines and mossy rocks. Birds chirped in the trees above, and the sun filtered through the canopy, casting dappled patterns on the forest floor. It was a beautiful morning as they hiked toward their campsite, chatting and laughing, unaware of what awaited them. When they arrived at the clearing where they intended to set up camp, the sight before them was strange. Several tents were pitched in a disorderly manner around the area, but they appeared abandoned. No campfires, no people, just the eerie quiet of the forest. "That's odd," Ben said, stepping forward to inspect the nearest tent. "I thought this place was supposed to be crowded on weekends." Sarah, always the curious one, walked over to another tent. "Look at this," she said, pointing. "There are personal belongings inside. A sleeping bag, a half-filled water bottle. Why would someone just leave all of this?" The group exchanged uneasy glances. It was unusual for campers to leave their gear behind, especially when it was obvious that the tents had been set up recently. No one had seen or heard anyone nearby, and yet there they were, abandoned tents, clearly in use, but no sign of life. "I don't like this," Emily murmured. "Maybe we should just move on to the next site." But before they could discuss leaving, Jake noticed something more unsettling. "There's fresh firewood here," he said, pointing to a pile of neatly stacked logs beside the campfire pit. "And look at this, half-eaten food, like someone was just here." He motioned to a plate of sandwiches sitting on a makeshift table, untouched but clearly recently prepared. The bread was still soft, and a small bit of lettuce hung from one side. The smell of the food, though faint, still lingered in the air. "Someone must have been here recently," Lisa said. "But where are they?" The tension among the group grew as they moved deeper into the campsite. More abandoned tents, more belongings left behind. It felt like the campers had vanished in the blink of an eye. "Maybe we should search the area," Sarah suggested. "They might have gone for a hike or something." So they spread out, each checking the surrounding trees and paths. No signs of a struggle, no tracks in the dirt. The campsite felt strange, like something was off, but everything seemed too clean, too quiet. After a while, they regrouped, none of them having found any trace of the other campers. "This is starting to freak me out," Ben admitted. "We should just pack up and leave." Just as they began to gather their things, Sarah, who had been standing near the edge of the clearing, froze. Her heart raced as she saw something shift among the trees. Shadows, figures, moving too swiftly to be animals. Her breath caught in her throat. "What's wrong?" Emily asked, looking towards Sarah. I saw something," Sarah whispered, her voice shaky. "Over there, in the trees. It looked like someone was watching us." Jake's eyes darted toward the woods, his face pale. "What do you mean, someone?" "I don't know," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "It was just a shadow, but I swear there was movement. Something or someone." The others looked around nervously. The forest around them seemed to grow darker, the shadows lengthening, as if the trees themselves were closing in. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves, and the hairs on the back of their necks stood on end. Lisa took a step toward the woods. "We need to leave now," she said urgently. "This place doesn't feel right." Ben nodded, already packing up his things. "Let's just go. Now." But as they hurriedly gathered their gear, they heard it, the sound of footsteps. Not animal footsteps, but heavy, deliberate steps crunching in the underbrush. They all froze. The steps grew closer, as if someone or something was slowly approaching. Jake turned to look back at the abandoned campsite. His face went pale when he noticed that the shadows among the trees were no longer just shadows. They were figures, dark, indistinct forms shifting in the woods, moving closer to the clearing. "Let's go," Emily screamed, and the group didn't hesitate. They grabbed their packs and bolted for the trail, hearts pounding. As they ran, they swore they could hear the whispers of the forest, voices, indistinct but unmistakable, trailing behind them, as if something was just out of reach, following them. The figures in the trees seemed to move in sync with their footsteps, always keeping a distance, but never quite disappearing. They didn't stop running until they reached their car, breathless and terrified. When they looked back, there was no sign of the campsite, no tents, no shadows, nothing. It was as if the whole scene had disappeared into the forest, leaving them with nothing but a lingering sense of dread. For days after, they couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching them, something that had left its mark on the clearing but would never be seen again. The abandoned campsite remained a mystery, and the shadows in the trees never truly left their minds. The friends swore never to return to that part of the forest, and each of them, in their own way, carried the weight of that strange, unsettling encounter for the rest of their lives. Who had been camping there before them? Why did they leave everything behind? And who, or what, was watching them from the trees? The answers they would never know. Story 7. The Voices in the Night. It was supposed to be a peaceful solo camping trip, a chance to disconnect from the world and find solace in the vast, rugged desert of Arizona. Peter, an experienced hiker and camper, had set up camp in a remote area miles away from the nearest road or civilization. The night was quiet, too quiet, in fact, save for the occasional rustling of the wind, which stirred the loose sand and sent the campfire's flames flickering in strange patterns. Peter lay on his back in the small tent, staring up at the stars, the silence of the desert soothing in its own way. The sky above him was a blanket of deep black, studded with countless stars that seemed so close. He could almost reach out and touch them. But it was the silence that kept pulling at him, an eerie, heavy stillness that seemed to hang over the entire landscape. He'd camped in remote areas before, but there was something different about this place, something unsettling. Around midnight, the wind shifted. The once peaceful desert breeze turned into a faint whisper. At first, Peter thought nothing of it. The desert had a way of playing tricks on your senses. Shifting winds, distant calls of coyotes, the faint rustle of wildlife moving through the brush. But then, the whispers became more distinct. They weren't the wind. They sounded like voices. Soft, almost inaudible at first, as if they were coming from a distance. But as the minutes passed, they grew louder, closer, more deliberate. Peter froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He strained to make out the words, but the voices were just beyond his understanding, as if they were speaking a language he couldn't recognize. He sat up in his tent, his senses heightened. The whispers were no longer a gentle murmur. They were clear, intentional, like a conversation happening just outside his campsite. His mind raced. There was no one else out here, he reminded himself. He was miles from any other human being. This was the kind of place where people came to escape the world, not where you expected to hear voices in the dark. "Hello," Peter called out, his voice trembling slightly. "Is someone out there?" The whispers stopped. There was a long, suffocating silence. Then, just as Peter began to convince himself it was all in his head, the voices returned. This time, they were louder, more pronounced, as though a group of people was standing just outside his tent. He couldn't understand what they were saying, but there was an undeniable sense of presence, like they were speaking directly to him. "Hello," he called again, his voice shaky with a growing sense of dread. "Who's there?" Nothing, but the voices continued, their murmurs wrapping around him like a physical presence. It was as if they were moving, circling his campsite. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, a cold chill creeping up his spine. Every part of him screamed that he wasn't alone. The desert had always been quiet, peaceful, even in its harshness. But this felt wrong. The wind picked up again, but it wasn't the wind that made Peter's heart race now. It was the unmistakable feeling of being watched, of being surrounded by something unseen. The whispers grew louder still, their tones now urgent, as if they were trying to convey a message Peter couldn't decipher. He could hear the soft shuffle of footsteps, too, like someone or something was pacing around his tent, circling him. He grabbed his flashlight, his breath shallow and erratic. The beam of light flicked wildly in the darkness, but all it revealed were the shadows of the sparse desert flora, cast long and distorted by the light. There was no one there, but the voices, they were so real, so close, and they were growing louder, rising in pitch. Panic began to claw at him. He stood up in his tent, feeling the air thicken around him. His heart was hammering in his chest, and his hands shook as he unzipped the door to his tent. As he stepped outside, the desert night greeted him with nothing but an overwhelming sense of isolation. The voices were everywhere now, surrounding him, echoing in the stillness of the night. It felt as though they were coming from all directions, their whispers growing louder, as though hundreds of unseen people were talking at once. His ears rang with the noise, his mind scrambling to make sense of it. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to run as far away from this place as he could. He didn't care about the campfire or his gear. All he wanted was to escape whatever presence was out there, following him with those insistent whispers. Peter grabbed his backpack and hurriedly packed his things, his movements frantic, hands trembling as he stuffed his gear into the bag. The whispers seemed to grow louder with every passing second, but they weren't just distant sounds anymore. They felt close, as though they were right behind him. He didn't know what was happening. Maybe it was his mind playing tricks on him, or maybe the desert itself was alive with some ancient presence that wasn't meant to be disturbed. But whatever it was, he couldn't take it any longer. Peter grabbed his flashlight and rushed to the trailhead, his heart racing. He didn't even stop to take a last look at his campsite. The whispers were still in his ears, echoing behind him, but he couldn't tell if they were following him or if they were simply in his mind. He was too far gone to care. He ran through the desert night, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he stumbled through the dark, fighting the fear that gripped him tighter with every step. The whispers seemed to follow him, trailing behind him like a shadow. No matter how far he ran, they didn't stop. By the time the sun began to rise, casting the desert in pale light, Peter had made it back to the main road. Exhausted, disoriented, and shaken to the core, he stopped. The voices had finally faded, but their echo lingered in his mind. It wasn't until he reached the nearest town, still rattled by the experience, that he learned something unsettling. Another camper, just a few miles from his spot, had reported hearing strange whispers in the desert that night too. But when the authorities went to investigate, they found nothing. No tracks, no signs of anyone, just the desolate emptiness of the desert. Peter never returned to that spot, and though the whispers in the night eventually faded from his memory, he would always wonder what had truly been out there, what had followed him, and why the desert had spoken to him that night. And deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was still waiting, still watching. Story 8. The creepy campground host. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, a weekend camping trip to a secluded state park in Montana. Sarah and Ben had been planning it for weeks, eager to escape the chaos of their busy lives and immerse themselves in nature. They had chosen a quiet campground far from the main roads, nestled in a dense forest, with little more than a few other campers spread across the park. It seemed like the perfect place for some much-needed relaxation. When they arrived at the campground, the sky was overcast, casting a soft, gray light over the landscape. The trees were tall and dense, their branches heavy with rain from earlier in the day. The air smelled fresh, tinged with pine and earth. As they unloaded their gear, they noticed the campground host approaching them, a middle-aged man with thinning hair, a faded red cap, and a worn flannel shirt. He greeted them with an unnerving smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Welcome to Pine Hollow Campground," the man said, his voice smooth but carrying an almost forced cheerfulness. "I'm Carl. If you need anything, feel free to ask." At first, Sarah and Ben thought nothing of it, but something about the way Carl spoke made them feel uneasy. It wasn't just his overly polite demeanor. It was the way he asked questions that felt too personal. "You folks camping here for the weekend?" Carl asked, his gaze lingering a bit too long on Sarah and Ben's faces. "Where are you from? Do you need a map? Any plans to hike the trails around here? The weather's supposed to hold out, but it's best to be prepared, especially after dark." They politely answered, but each time they responded, Carl seemed to know just a bit more than he should. He mentioned knowing the best trails in the area, how the weather could shift unexpectedly, and how quiet the nights could get in the campground. It was a little too specific for comfort. Ben tried to brush it off, chalking it up to the man being friendly, but Sarah wasn't so sure. The conversation lingered a bit longer than expected, but eventually, Carl bid them farewell, reminding them again that he was there if they needed anything. Sarah couldn't shake the strange feeling in her stomach, a sense of being watched, of something just slightly off about the whole encounter. Ben, eager to get the campfire started, suggested they settle in and not overthink things. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Sarah and Ben made their dinner, a simple meal of hot dogs and baked beans over the fire. The surrounding woods grew quieter, the usual chirping of birds replaced by the distant sounds of rustling leaves and the occasional bark of a lone fox. They both enjoyed the serene atmosphere, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that someone was nearby, watching them. Nightfall came swiftly. After their meal, they settled into their tent, the wind whispering softly through the trees. It was late, well past midnight, when they first heard it. At first, it was just a faint sound, like shuffling footsteps in the leaves. Then, it grew louder, a slow, deliberate movement around the perimeter of their campsite. Ben stiffened, his breath catching in his throat. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice tight with fear. Ben nodded but didn't say anything. The footsteps stopped, only to be replaced by soft whispers, almost inaudible but distinct enough to send chills down their spines. They strained to hear, but the words were garbled, like someone speaking in a language they couldn't understand. "Maybe it's just another camper," Ben said, trying to stay calm. "They're probably just walking around, maybe lost." But the whispers grew more persistent, and the footsteps circled their campsite. Sarah felt her heart race in her chest. Something didn't feel right. "Ben, this isn't normal," she said, her voice trembling. The night dragged on in silence, save for the occasional rustle and the whispers that never seemed to cease. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and they both fell into an uneasy sleep. But Sarah woke up again a few hours later, her senses heightened. She felt a strange pressure on the tent, as though someone or something was leaning against it, just on the other side of the thin fabric. She didn't dare make a sound. Her mind raced as she lay there, waiting for whatever it was to move on. But the sensation didn't go away. The air around her felt thick and heavy, and the whispers were back, low and almost imperceptible, creeping closer. Just as she was about to wake Ben, the pressure against the tent disappeared. The air lightened, and the whispers faded into the night. When the first light of morning broke through the trees, Sarah and Ben were both exhausted, physically and mentally drained from the night's events. They crawled out of the tent, hoping to shake off the unease of the previous night. As they packed their gear, Ben noticed something odd, something they hadn't seen before. Their tent, which they had carefully secured the night before, had been moved slightly. It wasn't a lot, but enough to suggest that someone had disturbed it while they slept. There were no signs of anyone around, but Sarah felt a deep, unsettling sense that someone had been there during the night. Her eyes scanned the campsite, looking for any trace of the intruder, but nothing. The woods stood still and quiet, as if nothing had happened at all. As they packed up and prepared to leave, Sarah noticed Carl in the distance, standing by his truck, watching them. He smiled, but it wasn't the same smile from the night before. It was wider, almost knowing, like he was aware of everything that had transpired. She shuddered but didn't say anything to Ben. They simply loaded up the car and drove off, the strange feeling lingering long after they left the campground. They never saw Carl again. Years later, when they returned to the area, they heard rumors about a campground host who had once disappeared mysteriously. Some claimed that he had been dismissed after a series of odd incidents and complaints from campers, but no one really knew for sure. All Sarah and Ben knew was that something wasn't right about that night, and about the man who had greeted them when they first arrived. Story 9. The Disappearing Trail. It was supposed to be the perfect camping trip. A group of seasoned hikers, eager to spend a few days in the pristine wilderness of the White Mountains of New Hampshire. The group, for friends in their late 20s, had been planning the trip for months. They were no strangers to the outdoors, having spent countless weekends in the mountains. But this was their first time exploring this particular stretch of forest. They had heard it was beautiful, remote, and untouched by the usual crowds. The first day of hiking had been smooth. The weather was crisp, with the sun filtering through the trees, casting long, dappled shadows on the forest floor. They had hiked several miles through the dense forest, taking in the sights of the towering pines, the rustling leaves, and the occasional glimpse of wildlife. They found a small, secluded clearing near a stream, perfect for setting up camp. As the evening drew near, they set up their tents, built a fire, and prepared their dinner, enjoying the peaceful solitude of the forest. By nightfall, the air had cooled, and the fire crackled warmly. They laughed and told stories, enjoying the isolation that camping in such a remote area provided. It felt like they had the entire forest to themselves. The next morning, they woke to an overcast sky, the kind that promised a day of quiet solitude. After breakfast, they packed up their campsite and set out for a short hike up to a nearby ridge. The trail had been well marked the day before, with bright orange markers on trees and small, carved arrows on rocks guiding the way. They knew they had to retrace their steps to return to the trailhead later, so they followed the path eagerly, excited to explore more of the mountain. But when they arrived back at the clearing where they had camped, something felt wrong. The trail had vanished. At first, they thought they had simply missed the markers, so they retraced their steps, looking for the familiar orange ribbons. But the trees that had once held the markers were now bare, and the rocks that had guided them the day before were gone. The once visible path through the forest was now a tangled mess of underbrush and unmarked trees. Even the large boulders they had passed on their way to the ridge had seemingly disappeared. "What the hell?" one of the hikers, Mark, muttered, a hint of confusion in his voice. "This doesn't make any sense. We came through here yesterday, and there was no way we could have missed it." They started wandering in circles, trying to find some sign of the trail, but it was as if the forest itself had swallowed it up overnight. The landmarks they had relied on, the tall pine tree, the large boulder, the fallen log, were all different or simply gone. Panic slowly crept into their thoughts. They called out to each other, trying to stay close, but the woods seemed to muffle their voices. The only sounds were the crunching of leaves underfoot and the occasional bird call, which felt unnervingly distant. "Maybe we're just disoriented," Sarah suggested, trying to stay calm. "We should go back to the stream. That'll be our best bet." They made their way back to the stream, hoping to use it as a landmark to guide them. But even the familiar rushing water seemed different now. The path beside the stream that had once been clear was now overgrown with weeds and shrubs. It was as though the forest had reshaped itself in a matter of hours. Nothing made sense. As the hours passed, their anxiety grew. What had been a simple, enjoyable hike was quickly turning into a nightmare. Their water and supplies were limited, and the daylight was slipping away. Every time they thought they found a potential path, it led to a dead end or a thick cluster of trees. "We have to keep our heads together," Mark said, trying to keep the group calm. "We'll find the trail. Just stay focused." But after more than 3 hours of wandering, it became painfully clear that they were lost. They had no idea where they were or how to get back. The familiar landmarks were nowhere to be found, and the trail had completely disappeared. "Guys, we need to think about our options," James said, his voice trembling slightly. "If we don't find the trail soon, we're in real trouble." The group was growing desperate. They were far from the nearest road. The sun was beginning to set, and the woods seemed to stretch on forever, with no sign of civilization. The fear of being trapped in the vast wilderness began to sink in. They knew they had to stay together, but the creeping realization that they might not make it out alive was terrifying. In the distance, they spotted a faint trail cutting through the trees. It wasn't marked, but the path was clear enough to follow. With no other option, they decided to follow it, hoping it would lead them out of the woods. For the next hour, they followed the unmarked trail, not knowing whether it was leading them in the right direction or deeper into the forest. As the last light of day began to fade, they came upon a familiar landmark, a large boulder they had passed earlier in the day. But it was positioned differently now, as if it had been moved. Confused and exhausted, they pushed on. The trail finally opened up to a small clearing, and in the distance, they spotted a road. They rushed toward it, finally emerging from the forest, trembling and disoriented. They had made it out. The group was shaken, but they couldn't explain what had happened. How had the trail disappeared so completely? Why had the forest seemed to shift overnight, as if it had rearranged itself to keep them from finding their way? There was no clear answer. The woods had played a cruel trick on them. When they made it back to their car, they couldn't help but feel as if the forest had been alive, watching them, guiding them into a labyrinth of confusion. And though they were relieved to be out of the woods, they couldn't shake the feeling that something had been toying with them, hiding the trail on purpose, as if to remind them that the wilderness wasn't always as predictable as they thought. They never spoke of the incident again, but each one of them knew that the White Mountains held a secret, one that might never be understood. Story 10. The Footsteps That Followed. It was a crisp autumn morning when Jake set out on his solo camping trip. He had planned it for weeks, an escape into the Idaho wilderness, a chance to clear his head and disconnect from the noise of everyday life. He had been hiking for hours, following a secluded trail that led deep into the forest, far from the reach of any park rangers or other campers. The air was cool, and the scent of pine filled his nostrils. The only sound was the crunch of dry leaves beneath his boots and the occasional rustling of birds in the trees. Jake had hiked alone many times before, but this was different. There was something off about the area, something he couldn't quite place. The forest was unnervingly quiet. There were no animals stirring, no sounds of squirrels or birds calling to each other. Just an unsettling stillness that seemed to weigh down on him. He shrugged it off, attributing it to the remoteness of the location. After all, he had come here for peace, for solitude. The silence, however, began to feel oppressive as he trudged along the trail. Something caught his attention, the distinct sound of footsteps crunching on the leaves behind him. At first, Jake assumed it was another hiker. He had been warned that this trail was popular with people looking to escape the crowds, so it made sense that someone would be behind him. He slowed his pace, glancing over his shoulder, but saw nothing. The trail was empty, with only the winding path behind him, overgrown in places with thick vegetation. Probably just someone catching up, he muttered to himself, trying to shake off the unease creeping up his spine. But the footsteps didn't stop. They continued, just behind him, growing louder, closer. The crunch of the dry leaves was unmistakable, and it was clear that whoever, or whatever, was behind him was following his every step. Jake's heartbeat quickened. He turned again, but once more there was nothing, just the stillness of the forest and the faint echo of footsteps that seemed to be getting closer, as if the person behind him was matching his pace perfectly. It's just my mind playing tricks, he thought, shaking his head and trying to focus on the path ahead. But the footsteps grew louder, more insistent. Every time Jake sped up, the steps behind him quickened in tandem. It was as though someone or something was right on his heels. His mind raced. He was starting to feel a little panicked, but he couldn't understand why. This was a well-known trail, one that other hikers frequently used. Surely, someone was behind him. His legs began to ache, but the footsteps never stopped. They were so close now, the sound so clear, that Jake felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He glanced over his shoulder again, this time with more urgency, but there was still no one there. His breath was shallow, and his thoughts were spiraling. What was happening? At this point, Jake was moving faster, almost running now. The trail seemed to stretch on endlessly, and his lungs burned, but still, the footsteps followed, never faltering, never breaking their rhythm. Jake's mind began to race with impossible thoughts. Could it be a trick of the wind? An animal moving close behind? But the sound was too distinct, too purposeful to be anything natural. The crunching leaves were too steady, too rhythmic. They were human-like in their timing, yet no human was there. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of walking faster than he ever had, Jake stumbled upon his campsite. His legs were exhausted, and his heart was pounding in his chest. He threw down his pack and immediately set about starting a fire, hoping to shake off the lingering fear. But as he knelt down to gather firewood, his stomach dropped. Around his tent, fresh footprints had been left in the dirt. They were large, but not quite the size of a bear's. The shape was wrong, too irregular. They were too small for a bear, but too large for a human. The prints were deep, as if something heavy had been circling his camp. The oddest part was that the tracks didn't seem to belong to any animal he recognized. There were no claws, no clear shape of a foot, only impressions that seemed to flicker and shift as if they didn't belong to anything living. Jake froze. His mind raced as he stared at the prints. There was no way someone had followed him to his campsite. Yet here they were. And they weren't just around his tent. They were everywhere. The footsteps encircled him, but they didn't seem to have a clear direction. The prints were haphazard, as if whatever had been walking around his tent hadn't been following a set path, but instead, it had been moving erratically, circling as though unsure of its intentions. A chill ran down Jake's spine, and he felt the overwhelming need to leave. The woods had grown even quieter now, if that was even possible. His thoughts were spinning, unable to grasp the reality of what he was seeing. He thought he heard another sound, faint, almost like a whisper, but when he turned toward it, there was nothing. Only the quiet forest, the unnerving silence that had greeted him since the moment he stepped foot on this trail. He grabbed his gear, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't care if it was still hours before dark. He wasn't staying in this forest for another minute. The strange, disjointed footprints around his camp were enough to tell him that something wasn't right. Something was out there. Jake made his way back down the trail as quickly as he could, each step heavier than the last. The footsteps that had been trailing him earlier seemed to follow him now, echoing behind him as he walked, but this time, he didn't dare look back. He didn't need to see what was behind him. He knew it was there. It took Jake hours to get back to his car, though it felt like days. He never stopped running. When he finally reached his vehicle, he looked around, half expecting to see something or someone standing in the shadows. But there was nothing, just the thick Idaho wilderness, as silent and empty as when he had arrived. Jake never went camping alone again. The memory of those footsteps, the strange prints around his tent, and the feeling of being watched haunted him long after he had left the wilderness behind. No matter how much he tried to rationalize it, the truth was clear to him. There was something in those woods that day, and it was still out there,